August 18th, Deadline Hollywood revealed that production company Morgan Creek has a reboot of The Exorcist planned for release in 2021. From there, the story exploded everywhere. Despite all the headlines though, they're all derived from this one sentence. Current Morgan Creek projects include Stay Tuned at AMC, with a planned theatrical reboot of The Exorcist in the works for 2021. That's it. That's all we have to go on. So what do they mean by reboot this time? A contemporary continuation that ignores everything but the first movie, Halloween style? A new adaptation of the original novel? Or some other form of remake of the first movie? Although one may be jumping to conclusions, most assume that is what we're talking about here, some kind of remake. Morgan Creek said they would never do that, but that was like 5 years ago, so that doesn't mean much in a post-Beerbug world. And if it is a remake of sorts, it wouldn't be the first time Morgan Creek remade an Exorcist movie either, because before there was the Snyder Cut, there was the Schrader Cut. In this video, I'll begin by briefly retelling the story of the 2 Exorcist prequels, before exploring in greater detail just what went down with the first-hand account, and finally discuss some thoughts on the upcoming reboot, whatever it may be. In August of 2004, Morgan Creek released the Renny Harlin directed Exorcist: The Beginning, a prequel to the original Exorcist. But Renny Harlin wasn't the original director. That would have been Paul Schrader, the writer of Martin Scorsese's Taxi Driver, Raging Bull, and The Last Temptation of Christ, as well as the director of American Gigolo and Cat People, to mention but a few of the many highlights of his illustrious career. Production company Morgan Creek tasked this great writer, an okay director, with making them an Exorcist prequel. And he did. But for all the virtues Schrader's finished movie had as a drama, it wasn't quite the prequel to the horror classic The Exorcist that the studio had imagined. Schrader's deconstruction of the exorcism scene itself was a huge point of complaint. So they fired Schrader, and by the time all was said and done, Renny Harlin of Elm Street 4, Die Hard 2, The Long Kiss Goodnight, and Deep Blue Sea fame had remade the entire movie, with an entirely new cast, apart from Stellan Skarsgård that is, who was pretty much the only holdover left from Schrader's original and completed but defunct movie. Providing the special makeup effects that were expected of an Exorcist movie was Gary J. Tunnicliffe of Hellraiser fame. The defunct Schrader cut of the Exorcist prequel was the Snyder cut of its day. Fans demanded to see it, and in 2005, Morgan Creek released it too, direct to DVD, under the title Dominion, prequel to The Exorcist. That whole ordeal was unprecedented. There were examples of other directors doing reshoots and finishing up movies that others had started, like Richard Lester and Richard Donner on Superman 2, but nothing like this. So, let's explore what happened in a bit more detail. With me to do that is someone who was there, a director and filmmaker in his own right, special makeup effects designer extraordinaire, and a friend of the channel. Welcome back to Midnight's Edge, Gary J. Tunnicliffe.
It's my pleasure to be back. Always fun to talk to you guys about what's going on and to revisit some of these stories and then hopefully do some things that are pertaining to the future of film as well.
It's always a pleasure to have you back, Gary. And we will be discussing some very topical subjects before long, and everyone should check back for that. But for right now, The Exorcist prequel. How did you become involved with that? And where was the production at the time?
Right, Exorcist Beginning, or I think Exorcist Dominion, as it may have been called when I was first involved, or I can't remember if it was Beginning or Dominion at that point, but my first introduction to that project was I got a call from Patrick Lussier, the director of Dracula 2000, Drive Angry, My Bloody Valentine, etc. Patrick behind the scenes has done a lot of what they call consultancy in Hollywood, which is where he will be brought in by various film productions to either do reshoots or to restructure movies. A lot of this isn't talked about by films because it's not very popular, because obviously it's usually when they've had a falling out with the director or they've decided to go in a different direction. But Patrick was well regarded as kind of a fix-it guy because of his editorial knowledge and also because how kind of effective is it doing these things. But it wasn't his first rodeo. And he'd been brought in by David Robinson and those guys to take a look at the Schrader version and come up with a plan. And he'd asked that I would be involved in that. And, of course, I was very excited. Exorcist, why wouldn't you be? My first thing was I got a call and was said, can you come down to Morgan Creek and meet David Robinson? And we'd like you to watch the film, to watch the Paul Schrader version. And I was like, oh, great, excellent, And I knew that they'd spent a large amount of money, and basically I was very excited. I was going to get my own little private screening of this movie, so I remember going down there and watching it, and 15 or 20 minutes in, kind of, I'm sure a visible frown came over my forehead, and I think I remember looking at them and going, Paul Schrader directed this? And they were like, mm-hmm. And I was like, Paul Schrader, autofocus, the great writer, director, They're like, uh-huh. And I was like, okay. And I watched a bit longer. And then I think, and this might sound really offensive, I think I turned around and said something like, this is awful. And they were like, mm-hmm, yeah, that's why you're here, young man. You know what I mean? And I think initially the plan was that Patrick would do 2 or 3 weeks of, insert photography. It later came out that, and the headlines were, oh, Patrick Lussier is just going to shoot gore and blood, and they're going to, Morgan Creek want to turn Schrader's genius vision into a bloodfest, shockorama. And that wasn't the case at all. I think the concern was with certain performances in the film and certain narratives. Fundamentally, the young African boy character, they just didn't felt it really worked. And the exorcism at the end was very esoteric and very strange. So I think, there would have been an updated exorcism sequence. But very quickly what happened was I think there was going to be a 2 or 3 week reshoot, and ideas were starting to be spun about that would be. And all of a sudden, I was told that was nixed because Patrick was working on a project for Dimension at the time. I think it might have been one of the Scream movies or something else, and was basically told he wasn't released. They wouldn't release him from his contract working over at Dimension. It may have been Scream 3. I'm not too sure. But I know that Patrick was like, I can't do it. I'm not allowed to leave the project. I'm under contract to Weinstein's, to Dimension, to Bob. And I can't do it. So suddenly it had gone away. And the next thing I heard was Renny Harlin was being brought on board, and could I come in and meet with Renny? And I met with Renny. He was very no-nonsense and very to the point. And the basic idea then was they were looking at doing 2 or 3 weeks of reshoots and changing it. And the next thing I heard was that Renny had said, look, if we're going to do this, I have problems with certain characters and certain elements too. I just think if we're going to spend the money and do 3 weeks, why not spend the money and do 8 weeks and reshoot the whole bloody thing? For a reported budget, I believe the numbers that I heard being bandied around the office were something like $18 to $24 million. It wasn't a great deal of money. The plan wasn't to go to Africa or Morocco as they had done in the first film and Italy. The plan was to shoot everything on set at Cinecittà in Italy. Bring back some of the actors and recast some of the actors, and then everything will be done on stage. Italy had, I think it was the set from the sequel to the Flintstones movie, like Viva Bedrock Vegas or something, and they had all these rocky sets, and they were going to use those for the kind of Africa moments in the film, and they were going to rebuild the top of the cathedral, and they'd still got the cathedral set up, I believe, but that was suddenly the plan, was that it was being considered to reshoot the whole thing. And very, very quickly, I was told, we're going to reshoot the whole bloody thing. Here's a new script. Get to work on the effects. And we were suddenly under the gun. And the plan was to shoot, I think, 2 weeks before Christmas, and then another 6 weeks after Christmas, or a week before Christmas, and then 7 weeks after Christmas. It wasn't a long shoot. It wasn't a big, laborious, stretched out, expensive production. They were very tight on the numbers. And like I say, my recollection is the budget was between $18 and $24 million, and not the purported $60 million as it was touted later on. And I can tell a very specific story about that, actually, because I remember vividly being on the stage at Cinecittà with Renny, and he just got some edited footage back. This was towards the end of the shoot, and I was watching the footage of one of the sequences. I think it was the battle sequence, and I was like, wow, this looks really, really great. And Renny was kind of smiling at me and nodding his head, and I said, this looks really, really good. I said, you've done a great job for it. I thought the budget was 17 or 18 million dollars, and I think it was 24 after the reshoots we did as well. We did some additional photography, but I think the budget was about 17 million dollars. And I said, wow, look, you've done a great job. And laughingly, I kind of said, no one's going to let you direct a $60 million movie again after this, mate. You've done such a good job for 17. And he looked at me and he went, yeah, you're right. And literally days later, an article came out in the Hollywood Reporter or Variety saying, Harlin's Exorcist $60 million budget, remake of the Schrader version. And I was like, you know what? I bet that has come from Renny Harlin so that he doesn't get tarred with the I can make a film for $17 million brush.
Well, that's certainly interesting timing, isn't it? But on that note, Renny Harlin, how was working with him? And also, you're quite experienced within the realm of horror, and not just from designing special makeup effects, but also as a writer. Did Renny or anyone else in production take advantage of that?
Just to talk about Renny Harlin for a second, I'd heard rumours that Renny was a taskmaster and was hardcore and, didn't suffer fools easily. And I'd spoken to Stephen Norrington about him because I believe him and Stephen had become friends at one point. And Stephen said, don't expect any thank yous from Renny Harlin. He's not that kind of a guy, And sure enough, the day that I did the first test on Isabella, we did a makeup test on Isabella, and I kind of walked on set with Isabella in full, possession makeup. And Renny looked at it and went, oh, now we're doing an Exorcist movie, This is now an Exorcist movie. But we filmed it, and she did some expressions and did some dialogue. And then everyone left, and Renny just kind of walked out the room. And we were in a stairwell, and Renny didn't say anything about the makeup, and I was a bit confused. And maybe I was seeking, a compliment or a comment even, or a negative or a positive. And I remember looking down the stairwell, and Renny was at the bottom of the stairs. And I said, so Renny, do you like the makeup? Are you okay with it? And he just looked at me and he said, if I didn't like it, you'd know I'd be telling you. So take it as a compliment. I'm not saying anything, And I quickly learned that was Renny Harlin. If he didn't say anything bad, then assume that it's good, and you have to be cool with that and stop being such a, a little girl and wanting to be praised all the time. It's like, get on with it, But everyone said you'll never get thank you from Renny's and you'll never get applaud. But I think Renny knew who was working above and beyond the call, and I like to think that I was. I was really invested in the project. Obviously, I was a huge fan of Exorcist. I was a Renny Harlin fan. I liked what we were doing, and I felt I needed to be involved. And I remember we were doing a scene where everyone had been buried in sand, and at this point, Renny had broken his leg, so Renny couldn't walk around the set. He would sit in a monitor tent, and they gave him a microphone and he had a speakers, and the Italians nicknamed it the voice of God, because Renny would talk on this microphone and, put the camera over there and do this and do that, and he would kind of speak, and you'd hear his voice booming from the speakers. One day I was doing this sequence where people were buried in the sand, and it just seemed like everyone had lost interest and wasn't really doing anything. And I just jumped in and was burying things and dressing the set and trying to make everything look cool and make sure there's no footprints. And I was on my hands and knees crawling around on the set doing all this. And all of a sudden this voice boomed out over the microphone system. And it just went, Gary Tunnicliffe, you are doing a great job. I appreciate your hard work. Thank you. And I just thought that was great. I was like, yeah, that's awesome. Look at that. Renny Harlin does say thank you and everything else. I think Morgan Creek had definitely said to me, look, we want your input as a horror person. And Renny at several key moments was like, what do you think about this? And what do you think about that? And my opinions were listened to, and at times they weren't listened to. We hadn't seen the final exorcism sequence. It hadn't been written by Alex Hawley, who was this young guy who was very cool and was in the hotel with his laptop all the time working away voraciously. And I think they'd got the final exorcism sequence, and it was sent to me, and Renny said, what do you think? What do you think of the exorcism sequence at the end? And to me, it was very, very flat. It was just her in a demon makeup swearing a lot. And I said, Renny, I said, for God's sake, I said, look, this is a prequel to The Exorcist. And in 1972, we saw a 13-year-old girl take a crucifix, stab herself in the vagina, screaming, "Let Jesus fuck you." You know, she throws the cross away, grabs her mother's face, rubs it against her bloodied vagina, off camera, obviously, you know, and then says, lick me, and then punches her mother in the face. I said, you know, that's intense stuff. Even now, that would be hard to shoot, you know, and would raise the hackles of everyone. I said, so what we're doing now really isn't that strong. And Renny, quite rightly so, said, well, if you think you can do better, go and write me something. And I went away and I thought, you know what, I will. So that night I wrote a sequence and I sent it to him the next day. And he just wrote back to me and said, are you crazy? If I shoot that, they'll arrest me. And I was like, yeah, but I think that's where we need to be. We need to be on the edge with this stuff. And he's like, you're out of your mind. He said, that's just, you know, that's insane what you've suggested. He said, look, I like some of it. I'm going to use some little bits of it. But you're out of your mind if you think I'm going to shoot the rest of it. But the one thing I definitely did remember having an input on was the sequence in the hospital when the shaman attack. Because originally that was a very different sequence. I can't even remember what was written originally. But I remember it being very, I don't know, it was just a bit clunky. And I think I said to Renny, I ended up writing most of that sequence and saying, look, we can do, because the reason I suggested leeches, I said, have them put leeches on his body, because we just done leeches in Dracula 2000. And I thought they looked really cool, you know, having leeches on a body. Always gets a good reaction from an audience when you see leeches close up being put on the skin. And I said we could have shaman in the white makeup, you know, we could do that kind of white crusty makeup and then have them do this kind of weird shamanistic thing and then have the furniture fall on them and break the fingers and do compound fractures, which I always think compound fractures work really well and they're very, very simple to apply. So I do remember that sequence there being very, very involved, the writing of that sequence. But most of it was as scripted. And my memories of the whole thing really were Renny being a great leader. I mean, he's to me, he's a guy's guy. I mean, he's as tough as nails. He's very funny. I'd love to work with him again and would happily follow him into battle. And I always consider filmmaking to be a kind of a battle, if you like. It's you're in the trenches with someone. And he's a captain, a sergeant, a general, whatever you want, who says, look, guys, we're going to storm that machine gun nest there. He doesn't pull on his lip and scratch his forehead saying, I don't know, what would you do? And, you know, I'm not very sure. Renny knows what he's doing. He knows how to cut a sequence. He knows what to get. He knows what he needs. And he's very forthright in doing it. And some people can say he's a great filmmaker and some people can say he's a bad filmmaker. But you knew where you were at with that guy and he knew what he was doing. And I love directors like that.
How was working with the cast? Then I mean both those that were brought in on short notice, and in particular Stellan Skarsgård, you know, the one actor who did the whole movie twice.
Great cast. Isabella Skrocko was lovely and so patient wearing the makeup. James Darcy was excellent. And Stellan Skarsgård, bless him, nicest guy in the world, but was clearly experiencing a strange Groundhog Day life on set. Where he just come in bemused some day saying, I feel like I've done this before, but you were all different people, you know. So, yeah, it was an interesting experience.
Well, that brings us neatly right back to the big controversy here, namely that there are two alternate versions of the same basic story. Since the moment the Renny Harlin version of the movie was released, fans demanded to see the Paul Schrader movie as well, and it was indeed released direct to DVD the very next year. But here's my question. Were Morgan Creek swayed by fan demand, as they kind of implied in the press at the time, or did they really intend to release the Schrader version all along? Or let me put it another way. Was there ever a possibility that the Schrader version might have stayed buried forever?
No, you'd have to be crazy. No one's going to sit on a $30 million production that's finished. You know, why would you? I mean, it makes no sense at all. Clearly, the powers that be weren't going to just hide away their $30 million film. I think the plan was undoubtedly that The Exorcist: The Beginning would be the flagship product, and they would get that out and let the world see it. And then at a later date, you know, put out the Schrader version, because why not? Why the hell not? I mean, it's product, you know, it's ready to be looked at, whether it's loved or hated or not. I think clearly they chose the movie that was more commercial and more viable and more worthy of a theatrical release, and I think that is definitely the Harlin version. I have yet to meet anybody who will stand and look me in the eye and tell me that they think the Schrader version is a far better film. I don't think it is. I think that was what was funny at the time, was working on the movie and having people saying, oh, clearly the studio don't get it. Clearly they don't know the subtleties of horror that only Schrader does. Clearly they're censoring this brilliant artistic genius. And I mean, I don't think the movie is great, unfortunately. I think there's some very weak performances by various actors who I won't go and name them, but you can spot who they are because they're not very good at A, and B, they're the ones who get replaced in the Renny Harlin version. So it's obvious, and I think the performances are better in Exorcist: The Beginning. Does it do a bit more kind of graphic horror? Yeah. Is it less psychological? Probably. Undoubtedly, Exorcist: The Beginning is a far more commercial movie. And at the end of the day, again, like I've said it once, I'll say it again, it's show business, folks, not show friends, not show art. It's show we need to make some money. And I don't think the film that Schrader made would have made anywhere near the money that Exorcist: The Beginning did. And Exorcist: The Beginning did a pretty good run, had a pretty financially successful run. Made some money.
Speaking of commercial, let's go back to these most recent news. Namely that The Exorcist is being rebooted. At the time of making this, that's literally all we know. So let's assume for the moment that they in this case mean a straight-up retelling of the original Exorcist. What would be your thoughts on that?
I understand the need when you're talking to 12, 13-year-olds or 15-year-olds or 18-year-olds in 2020 that they would look at a movie and say, oh, that's an old movie, it's an old movie. But there are a couple of movies that have been made over the years that, to me, are such a product of their time and have such a feel and a style, and the way they are made is so unlike current filmmaking that they stand out and are very, very strong. I just don't think commercially you could capture what that film had. There's something about the fabric of that movie that wouldn't be made now. A studio would cut elements and they'd want it to be trimmer and quicker, and it would lose that very kind of weird documentary style to it. I just don't think it's a good idea. So I guess my fundamental phrase would be, if it ain't broke, why fix it?
Well, there's still the chance that they won't try to quote-unquote fix it, though, because all we really have to go on at this point in time is that this is a reboot, without being entirely sure exactly what they mean by that. So it's not entirely outside the realm of possibility that this could be a reboot in the same way that the Halloween movie from a couple of years ago was a reboot, when in reality it was a retelling of the second movie, only set today, like years after the original. Let's just say that that could be the case with this movie as well. If this were to be like a retelling of The Exorcist 2, taking place years later, what would be your thoughts on that?
If anything needs to be remade and redone, Heretic is the one. You know what I mean? Undoubtedly. But again, I think the problem therefore you have, if you go back and remake Heretic, selling that to an audience today is very tricky because people are just so out of touch. Yeah, horror fans know the Exorcist quintet, septet if you consider the Schrader version. But to try and put a movie out there now as the sequel to the most terrifying horror film that was ever made, people are going to go, hold on a second, sequel? So what is this? Is this not the third one? They're remaking. I think that would be way too confusing for everybody. So, a reboot to me feels like they're redoing The Exorcist, the original. I mean, reboot of what? The film, but sticking to Blatty's book?
Well, at this point in time, who can say? However, as we learn more, we'll be sure to keep all of you watching up to date. But for now, I would like to say thank you, Gary J. Tunnicliffe, from dropping by and sharing your insights and experiences from the set of The Exorcist: The Beginning.
Thank you very much. I could have told you a whole lot more of strange and interesting things, but we'd be here for hours and hours and hours. But it was a memorable experience and it was fun. Like I say, I had some great memories of some wonderful actors and some great crew. Being in Italy was amazing. The funny thing was we were actually in the original Exorcist can't remember the name of the hotel, but she calls, I don't know if you remember, but Reagan's mother calls a hotel in Italy to speak to Reagan's father on her birthday to get him to talk to her. That was the hotel we were staying at, which I always thought was hilarious. Like the Excelsior or whatever hotel it is that's mentioned, we were staying at that hotel. Yeah, it was an interesting movie, and it was interesting to see the reaction afterwards and to see people say, oh, it didn't do well. But I know for a fact that Warner Brothers and Morgan Creek were very happy with how much money it made and what it did. And I think it's got some interesting moments. It's a pretty well-crafted movie. It's a lot better than fucking the sequel, The Heretic. Is it better than Legion? No, look, I mean, I personally think Exorcist 3 is one of the greatest horror movies ever made. I really, really do, because I still think that is an absolute gem of a film. Virtually everyone I know who's seen it adores it and loves it. So,
The Exorcist Part 3 is indeed an underrated gem, and anyone out there who hasn't seen it, you need to check out the director's cut version of it. You won't regret it. Gary, as always, it's been a blast. Thank you for your time.
You're very welcome.